Today, maybe you picked this up in the theme and the songs that we've been singing this morning, but today we're going to talk about disappointments. I don't know if you kind of grab that in some of the songs, like, blessed be your name, the road marked with suffering, right? Blessed be your name, you give and you take away. Several of the songs that we sang had that theme to it. Disappointments, hardships, things that are difficult in life. Disappointment is just simply the feeling of sadness that comes with unmet expectations or unmet plans. Right? And in a mathematical equation, I found this as I was preparing for this message online. In a mathematical equation, disappointments is reality underneath our expectations, right? We have these expectations, we have these hopes, these dreams, and then there's reality, right? And disappointment is reality of these unmet expectations. Or maybe a way to visually see that is this little cartoon figure right here. Right? We have on the top these expectations, these dreams, this plan. Everything is going to take me on a smooth ride to the finish line, right? Where there's rainbows and roses and everything is great. The trip is going to be easy. But then the reality of life is it's full of disappointments, right? It's not just like a straight road, it's an incline. It's going up. It's not easy. And we just kind of get started towards the goal, whatever it is, and we end up in a pit. It's a bumpy road along the way, and sometimes some of us just get stuck in the pit and never get out of that first pit. We just sit down on a rock and we pout and we cry and we're just stuck and we can't figure our way out, right? And this is just a fantastic picture, and I hope it just kind of sticks in your mind for several minutes as I walk through the kinds of disappointments that you probably experience. Disappointment probably is a weekly thing, if not a daily thing. If you really think about it, right? So it goes something like this. You ask your daughter, please empty the trash, clean the toilets, and vacuum the stairs before I get home, right? This is in 8 hours that you got to complete the task. And you come home 8 hours later, and one thing is done. Disappointment. Or your spouse is out, and there's several things that we need in order to have a successful meal tonight. And so you send a text, and the spouse arrives home with 3 of the 7 things, right? Misreading of the text, something didn't go right, disappointment, right? And on we could go with these minor kinds of disappointments where, as a student, you study hard, and you keep studying, and all you get is a C+. Right? There's lots of these disappointments that happen in our life, maybe almost daily, definitely weekly. Unmet expectations. But then there are things that are more major in life, right? So there are some irritating physical things that are going in your body, and you can't figure out quite what's going on, so you make an appointment to the doctor. The doctor says, I'm not sure about these things, so you're referred to a specialist, and you arrive at the specialist, right, hoping that it's one of the better of the 3 options, only to be informed that it's not. Something more serious is going on in my body. Disappointment. Or there's a huge expense. The roof's got some leaks. It's got to get fixed now. The furnace goes. It has to get repaired. The engine blows. And it's significant dollars to fix the car. It's got to get done. But you had a planned vacation. Disappointments, right? How do you manage those resources? Or a job. It seems like a perfect fit. You apply for the job. You get invited for an interview. You go through the interview. You get invited back for a second interview. Only to be informed that somebody else gets the job and not you. Now, I don't know about you if you've had any of these unmet expectations. I personally have experienced every single one of them in my life. Every one of them. And just to kind of go off a little bit more on that last one, I found myself back in 2008 after working as an associate pastor at the Hershey Free Church for 12 years Dave Martin, who's the lead pastor there, after 33 years, retiring. And with that transition, a search team was put into place, an outside organization is brought in, and so begins this process. And that organization comes to me and they say, hey, you are being referred to us as a potential candidate for this position. Is this something that you believe God is calling you to? I took several weeks to pray through that. And I remember it was this week in 2008 when Valerie and I were away for a weekend, and we talked about this and came back with, no, we don't sense that God is calling us to do this. Only to find myself 6 months later sitting in as one of the senior leaders, sitting in the interview process and candidates coming through, and God, in that circumstance, speaking to me saying, you are prepared and ready to be a lead pastor. It was clearly the voice of God. This was something I had not anticipated, something that I was not pursuing. But in that moment, that voice of God spoke to me. It was confirmed a couple of days later while I was on my run on the trail, and his written word came to my mind, and he impressed on me again. And then it was confirmed one last time with a conversation with Dave Martin, the lead pastor, in which I said, hey, Dave, can you envision me? Can you see me as being a lead pastor? In which he affirmed. Fast forward, those two candidates that were part of this search process, one of them accepted a position somewhere else. The other one, the elders said no to. So that meant no candidates. And now I find myself saying, God, are you calling me to be lead pastor of Hershey Free Church? And so I entered that process. Long story, gets down to two candidates, myself and George Davis. George is the lead pastor at Hershey Free Church. He's been there since 2009. I go through that process, and December 8th, I remember these dates because these are significant moments in my life. December 8th, I get the phone call from our elder chairman, and he says, hey, Kirk, just want to let you know that after all day long deliberations, the elders determined that God is leading us to go with an outside candidate rather than an internal candidate. Disappointment. What do you do with that? Your very clear sense of this is what God is nudging you to, and your current reality, no, you're not the guy. What do you do with that? I can remember hanging up the phone and having a conversation with Valerie. She's like, where is God in this? What is he doing? You ever been there? Disappointments? Especially disappointments on like these big major things. They don't occur daily or weekly, right? Those disappointments, they occur maybe once in a year, maybe not even that much, maybe once in a decade. But what do you do when your current circumstances don't align with what it is that you sense that God is nudging you on and towards? What do you do? We're in this series titled Faith in Faithless Times. This is a series in which we're attempting to kind of look at the life of Abram, a character in the Old Testament who lived by faith, who learned to live by faith in faithless times. And we, in 2023, find ourselves living in a country, living in a time in which increasingly people are faithless. And they're going out on their own. They are figuring things out independent because they've come to the conclusion that because of the disappointments in life that God cannot be trusted. God is not dependable. Or there is no God at all. And thus, when they find themselves in the pit, they figure out their own way out. And it's not towards God. Today we're going to look at the story of Abram in Genesis chapter 15 and how he responded in faith in spite of his disappointments. So if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn to Genesis 15. If you don't, you can just follow on the side screens. There's lots of verses. I'm just going to read through the entire passage. And I invite you to just kind of soak it in. Remember, as we read the Old Testament, one of the key things about reading the Old Testament is to kind of put yourself in the story as the character, just to try to understand what it is that the character is experiencing. Secondly, look for things that stick out. Look for things that maybe are repeated over and over. And if you do that today, you're going to find there's a few things that get repeated a couple of times. And if you put yourself in the story, you're going to find yourself feeling disappointment, but also hope. And so let's begin in verse 1. After this, significant phrase. We'll come back to that, but incredibly significant phrase. There's lots that's underneath that. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. That is language that is used when a prophet receives a message from God. Over and over in the Old Testament, you find that exact phrase. And the word of the Lord came to Isaiah. And the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And the word of the Lord came to Micah. The word of the Lord, it is as though God is delivering a very clear and direct and explicit message. The word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. It's pretty cool to know that God speaks to people. And God said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield." Sound like some of the songs we just sang? "And your very great reward." But Abram said, "O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless?" Significant situation. "And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." Play on words. Damascus is the son of the heir. It's as though Abram is saying, this guy, what his name is going to be the heir of all that I have, and he's not my son. And Abram said, "You have given me no children, God, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him. Second time that phrase. "This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir." And so God then took him outside and he said, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed God, literally believed in the Lord, and he, God, credited it to him as righteousness. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur." Sounds very much like what God said earlier. "I am your shield, your great reward." Here God is saying, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of Chaldeans to give you this land, to take possession of it." But Abram said, "O sovereign Lord," second time Abram said this, "O sovereign Lord, how can I know I will gain possession of it?" Second time Abram asks a question about what it is that God has declared. So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." So Abram brought all of these to him, cut them in two, arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcass, but Abram drove them away. Now as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, third time, "Know for certain." Abraham had a question. How can I know? God says, in this deep darkness, in this way in which God is speaking to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country and not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. God is revealing to Abram the future. "But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your father in peace and be buried in a good old age." In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant. That's a contract. That's a treaty. It's a guarantee that something's going to happen. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." Some scholars suggest this is the space in which the Garden of Eden was. If you go back and read Genesis 1, 2, and 3 and read the details there, it is though God is saying, I'm giving you the choice, the best place. To your descendants, I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Interesting story. A whole lot of things going on in there. Some things that certainly we are not accustomed to. This whole idea of animals and a sacrifice and the cutting of them and what all is going on in there, and birds of prey that come down and he's got to chase them away. And some scholars are suggesting that that's actually a picture, it's a word picture of what is about to come, what will happen in the future. And that each one of those pieces, the animals and the birds of the prey, these all represent the nation of Israel that will eventually go down into captivity. The birds of prey being the Egyptians who will come and attempt to pick at them and to assault them, but it is God that will deliver them 400 years later. So there's all this kind of interesting stuff in here. Right? And so it is a big, long story, too. So where do you begin? Well, one of the ways to begin is to kind of begin taking the passage apart by looking at, what are those odd statements? What are those things that stick out? What are the things that are repeated? I emphasized several of them as we went through the passage to try and help you kind of grasp that. Now, remember, we're talking about disappointments, and we'll get there in just a second, but just to kind of give a lay of the land for this whole passage and to put it together for you. It looks like this. So a breakdown of the passage after this is getting at Abraham's disappointing situation. Right? And I'll unpack that in just a second. But it begins with Abraham is living in a disappointing situation. And then the way that the passage is structured is God comes into that disappointing situation. God speaks into that disappointing situation. And he declares something. He declares something about who he is. And then that is followed by Abraham asking a question. Abraham's scratching his head saying, there's things that aren't making sense to me about what it is that you have promised. And then that's followed with God's response. And then in the first section, we see Abram's response. And then the whole flow again repeats itself, beginning then at verse 7, in which God declares who he is. He steps into Abraham's situation, declares who he is. Abram again has a question because of his disappointing situation. He just can't figure these things out. God again responds, but in this response, God gives him a revelation of what is to come, some prediction of the future, and then God makes a covenant with Abram. And this covenant, there's nothing Abram does. This is God saying, I am going to do this. No expectation on your part. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing that you can do to please me to earn this. There's nothing you can do to displease me to lose it. I'm doing this. This is going to happen. I'm bringing this apart on your behalf. And there's no response from Abram. So that's the story, right? That's the guts of the story. That's how this thing flows out. Now let's get into some of the nuance about Abram's disappointing situation. So we began with that first phrase, right? Moses, the author here, says, after this. Well, what's the this? Well, the this is everything that comes from chapter 14 and 13 and 12, right? And so if we've been reading along, and if you're reading along in this story, you know in the back of your mind where we started 4 weeks ago with this series, that Abram is the son of Nahor. right? Or as the son of Terah. And he has a brother, Nahor, who has a son, Lot, right? And Lot becomes Abram's nephew. And Abram has a wife, Sarai, and she doesn't have any children, right? And we're introduced in chapter 11 to Abram and Sarai and their plight, that they don't have any children. And that's the theme that follows everything in Abram's life, this tension, this problem. God then appears to Abram, and this is the first time we observed in the first message, right? This is the first time that Abram has any idea who God is. God appears to him, and God makes a promise. This is the first time that Abram believes, comes to a place of putting his faith that there is a God, and he's interested in him. And God makes this promise, right? I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to bless people through you. This is the promise. But what we find after this promise is Abram is on his bike, right? He's riding towards the goal of the successful realization of this promise, but he immediately falls into a pit. That's what we found, what followed in the very next story. If you go back to chapter 12, verse 9, and what followed. The pit that he fell into, the disappointment was this. There was a famine in the land, right? And then Abram tried to solve it. And he got himself into a whole lot of problems and almost messed up the whole promise. And then secondly, the second situation, Genesis chapter 13, and this is what Caleb taught us on last week. Abram runs into a situation with his nephew Lot, right? They both have acquired so much. Tensions arise between each other, and they split up. And Lot moves in a direction away from God, which then sends Abram, he has to intervene in this situation because Lot ends up being carried off, and Abram has to go to war, and that's what all chapter 14 is about. And Abram delivers him. Right? And so there's this promise that Abram's trying to get to. He has this goal, this vision that God has said to him, I'm going to bless you, turn you into a great nation. But all he's experienced so far is pits, not disappointments. It's not happening. And then in this text, we learn that Abram is really struggling with his promise because he has no children. And so he clearly says to God, he's like, hey, this plan, how's this plan going to work out? It's not making any sense, right? I remain childless. You've given me no children. I think one of the things that's important for us when we look at this story of Abram is to simply understand and to know that as people, we are going to experience disappointments. I mean, that's really the whole story of Abram. He experiences disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. And he learns to live by faith. He learns to live by faith in the disappointment. He struggles with the disappointment, but he learns to live by faith, sometimes not choosing the right thing, sometimes getting himself into trouble. But if this is what happened to Abram, it's highly likely that it's going to happen to you. You're going to experience disappointments, and it shouldn't be a surprise. But it's one of the mistakes that people make in terms of living life. They think that if I move towards God, God is going to prevent disappointments from coming into my life. That is just not a biblical concept. Not at all. When you study Scripture, when you look at the characters all throughout Scripture, disappointment after disappointment after disappointment after disappointment is laced through their life. So we ought not be surprised that we experience disappointments. Another thing to say about that is you can run as fast as you want and as hard as you want, or you can sit down as long as you want, and you can try to do everything you can to insulate yourself from disappointments, but the reality is they're going to catch you. It's going to happen. You can say, because you've arrived in your disappointments, that it's because there's a God, and this God has disappointed you, and he hasn't come through, and you can conclude that and say, therefore, I'm going to live my life the way that I want to live my life. And guess what? Disappointments are still going to happen. Disappointments, it's just part of living in a broken world. And what we find next, though, in this story is that Abram, right, is struggling with this disappointment, and so God steps into the situation and declares something to him, which is a wonderful gift, right? God declares to Abram, look, Abram, how this happens, it's not clear, but what we see is the word of the Lord comes to Abram in a vision, right? Like, how does that happen? The word of the Lord coming, how does it come? What does that look like? It's not that God appears to him in this, like visually gives him some kind of visual appearance. It's not like God appears the way that he did to Moses in the burning bush, or the way that he did to Elijah in the mountain. God appears in some way. The word of the Lord comes to him somehow in a vision. Abram knows that this is God that's speaking to him, and God declares to him, I'm your shield and your great reward. These are two military terms, which kind of fits right after chapter 14, where Abram was at war getting Lot back, right? And God is saying to Abram, I am your protector. Okay, I'm your shield, right? You're in this disappointing situation, but you got to trust me that I'm your shield. Yes, you get in disappointing situations. Yes, you go down into the pit. Yes, but still I'm with you in the pit. Well, why did you let me get into the pit in the first place? That's what Abram does next, right? He asks these disappointing questions, like, where are you? Why aren't you saving me? Why aren't you getting me out of this situation, right? I'm stuck here. Why aren't you being a good shield? God says, I am your shield and your great reward. The idea of the reward, again, this is a military term, and it was what a soldier would earn for payment for his services to the king as he fought. And that's what the word means. It can also refer to just the idea of a wage that is earned from doing something. And God is saying to Abram, look, Abram, I've got you. Yes, you're in this disappointing situation, but I've got you. I'm going to protect you, and you need to trust in me. You need to put your faith in me, because I'm your reward. I'm going to make what I promised happen for you. But Abram can't figure this out, right? And if you put yourself in Abram's situation, it's pretty hard to figure out, how's this going to work? God, I'm childless. How am I going to turn into a great nation? It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm childless. I don't have any kids. The math doesn't add up. In his human mind, he couldn't figure this out. And so, I think a good conclusion for us is that we shouldn't be surprised either when we find ourselves asking these kinds of questions. See, what Abram is doing here, he's saying, God, you say that I'm going to have a child, but I can't figure out how I'm going to have a child, so I'm going to come up with an answer to that the best that I can. And he says, because I'm childless, I have this one is going to inherit my estate, Eleazar, from Damascus. So what's going on in Abram's mind in this moment is trying to come up with a solution to the problem that he's in. See, the problem is that Abram and his wife Sarah have nobody to care for them as they get older. They have nobody to pass on their inheritance to. Right? They have nobody who's going to be at their funeral and take care of those things. And so this is a pretty big situation for them. And this is a common thing that happened in this time. The common thing that happened in this time is that you would find somebody who you could give your estate to, somebody that you would somebody that you would adopt to become your son, and they would inherit everything. We see this through archaeology, this practice. So there's the next slide here describes this from a Mesopotamian legal document. There's lots of these adoption tablets that have been unearthed from this time period in which Abram lived. And here's an example of this, and because I can't read these guys' names because they're, in Akkadian and Syrian and Babylonian and all these different languages. Here we go. I just inserted Abram and Eleazar so you can kind of get a feel for this, because this is how this would have worked. But this is a tablet. This is an archaeological find. We have it in our hands, right? The tablet of adoption belonging to Zeki, the son of Akua, he gave his son Shaninima, who's like Eleazar in the story, in adoption to Sharialu, who's like Abram, right? And Abram, with reference to Eleazar from the lands and his earnings of every sort, gave to Eleazar one portion of his property. If Abram should have a son of his own as the principal son, he shall take a double share, and Eleazar shall be the next in order and take his proper share. As long as Abram is alive, Eleazar shall revere him. And when Abram dies, Eleazar shall become the heir. So that's how this legal adoption process would work. And while Abram received this message from God that he's his great reward and his shield, Abram couldn't figure out how he was going to get to the goal of having this great nation come from him. So the only thing that made sense to him was that he would have to adopt a son. And so this is what he put into place. Now, how does that apply to us today? Don't we find ourselves in the same circumstances, right? You're riding along on the bike of life with the goal, whatever it is, and you have a sense that God is in this. For me, it is to be a lead pastor, right? And I hit a bump. The answer is no, you're not going to be the lead pastor at Hershey Free Church. You're down in the pit, and this doesn't make any sense. And so you begin to ask questions of God, and this is exactly what happened when I hung up the phone. And I went and talked to my wife, and she's like, where is God in this, and what is going on? And this doesn't make any sense. I thought this was very clearly the work of God in our lives. And we shouldn't be surprised when we begin to ask questions of God, which is exactly what we did. God, what are you doing? Obviously, we're in this pit, and Hershey isn't your plan. But I can't see the future. I'm in the pit, in the disappointment. Every one of us who are in the disappointment right now, that's where you are. You're in the disappointment, and you don't have eyes to see into the future. And yet you have this promise or the sense that this is where God is taking you. He's going to do something, but you can't see how to get there. And so you do the best you can. You try to put the pieces together. And you do the best you can with putting the pieces together. Now, I would suggest that when we find ourselves asking these questions of God, it's appropriate to ask them. Throughout Scripture, we see this over and over and over. People asking questions of God. God, where are you in this? And God, why isn't this working out? And God, help me through this. And this is the natural human response when we find ourselves in difficult and disappointing situations, to ask God questions. We should not be surprised when we find ourselves in disappointing situations, and we should not be surprised when we find ourselves asking questions of God. It's what we do. Now, to kind of respond to all of this, God steps in and he says again, he speaks to Abram again, right? So Abram's struggling to understand all of this, and God says to him, in verse 4, the word of the Lord comes to him again, and he says that this man, Eleazar, will not be your heir, but instead a son coming from your body will be your heir. Now, if you've been reading carefully along the way in Genesis 12, 13, and 14, you would recognize that this is the first time that God clearly explained to Abram what was going to happen in terms of how he was going to arrive at the end goal. This is the first time that God tells Abram that you will have a son that will come from your body. Now think about this. Again, you're Abram, you're riding along, you end up in a pit, right? Pit after pit after pit. He's trying all along, trying to figure out the end goal. How is this going to work? He comes up with the conclusion. And then it's then that God steps in and he says, hey, that's not the solution. I have a different answer for you. And he clearly reveals to him, no, you are going to be a father from your body. The DNA in your body is going to unite with the DNA in your wife's body, and a child is going to come. It's the first time that God revealed that little bit of a very important detail to Abram. And then God says to Abram, I want you to go outside. So now it gives him another action, right? I want you to go outside, and I want you to look up at the stars, and I want you to count all of the stars. And if you can count them all, that's how many people are going to come from your body. And this is a pretty interesting invitation, right? And before I go there, I missed something important that I want to say, and that is Abram's response to God was, "O sovereign Lord," right? And then he asked his questions. It's important for us to recognize that. It's Adonai, Jehovah, sovereign Lord. Adonai is master. Jehovah is the God of the universe. Abram didn't doubt in God. He just couldn't understand what God was doing. And so into that situation, God says, I want you to go outside and I want you to look, right? And so he goes out and he looks at all the stars. Now, I've been thinking about this past week. Like, if you can count all the stars in the sky, that's how many descendants you're going to have, right? And I was like, come on, like, really, God? Like, all those stars, there's like gazillions of them. Actually, no, the answer isn't gazillion, it's septillion. Okay, that's the real, I looked it up. Like, how many stars are there in our universe? It's 1, 0, 0, 0, comma, 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 all the way up to 24 zeros. That's how many stars there are in the universe. But did you know this, that when you go out and you look up at the stars, all that you can see with your eye of that septillion is 5,000 stars. And actually, you can't even see all 5,000 because the earth gets in the way, so you can only see 2,500 of the stars. So God says, go out and look, and you can count. If he could count 2,500 of them, right? But God actually is going to turn him into a nation of more than 2 million people in 400 years. Now, this is something significant, right? So Abram, he goes out, he looks up into the stars, which, by the way, is a good thing for us to do. I found myself driving to Lancaster last Friday and Saturday to teach at LBC, Capital Seminary. And on my way, I was coming at just the right time, and the star that is closest to us was coming up. And it was turning this cloud red. It was amazing. And then there was a sliver, this bright yellow-orange color, right? And then as it came up, I could see the whole red ball. It was amazing. It was spectacular. As I'm driving on, I'm just like, the heavens declare the glory of God. This is remarkable. I've been in some of the deepest places away from any kind of civilization and laid out at night and looked up at the stars. It is amazing to look at the stars. It shrinks us down, and brings us to a place of awe and wonder, right? And this is Abram. He's out there, he's looking, and what happens? Something happens inside of him. In this disappointing situation in which he can't figure out what's going on, in which he has questions to God, and God speaks to him, Abram does what? In that moment, in his heart, he believes the Lord. He believes the Lord. He believes the Lord. He believes the Lord. He believes what God said. Something happened in his heart when he looked up and he saw the stars. And then another amazing thing happens, and God credited to him as righteousness. That verse is so significant. Abram simply believed, and God credited it to him as righteousness. The biggest problem that we have as people is called sin. Sin destroys everything. It destroys our relationships. You sin against me, I sin against you. You sin against people in your life. Sin breaks relationship between us and God. And And people spend their life trying to be righteous enough in order to cover over their sin. But you see, there's not enough righteous acts that you can do. You can't be good enough to cover over your sin. Instead, all it requires is just simply belief in God. Abraham believed God, and God wiped away his debt. That's what a credit is. You go to the store, you use your credit card, it's debt. The clerk gives you the stuff, you walk out, but you owe money, right? You owe a debt for your sin. And this text tells us that God wiped out Abram's debt and declared him righteous. He looked at the stars and he believed. You are in a disappointing situation. I don't know where you're at today, but I'm certain that you're experiencing disappointing situations. And when you're in the disappointing situation, what are you going to do? Do you sit down on the pile of rocks and just say, that's it, I quit? And some people do, and they quit because of the disappointing thing in life, and they stay in the pit, and they never take another step towards the goal. They just stay there. You have a choice. You can start climbing out of the pit. You can move towards the goal. You can move towards God. It's by faith. It's a step of faith. It looks like just every day saying, God, where are you? What are you doing? And how does your word direct and lead me? I found myself this past week as I was teaching at Lancaster Bible College, Capital Seminary, thinking about my story of how it is that I'm even here, that I have this privilege. Over the past 12 years, I've had the privilege of teaching over 200 students, 200 men and women who are training to be in pastoral leadership and leadership in the life of the church. 200 of these people, I've had the privilege of taking God's word, helping them to understand what is a shepherd, what does it look like to lead a church, what is a church, what does it mean to be a healthy church, to help them to work through a vision and a mission, internally strong, externally focused, that our goal isn't to be a worship service, but our goal is to help us all become like Jesus. Right? And I found myself thinking, this is amazing. I love it. Every time I get to do this, I walk away just so full of this gratitude that I can talk with young men, young women. Some of them are older too, but these are people who are giving leadership to the church all across this country. And to hear them give back, give feedback. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving your time. Thank you for helping me to understand these things. You know what? This reality would never have happened had I stayed in the pit. Had I been at Hershey Free Church. You see, it was when I was in the pit that I took another step towards God, which looked like me listening and taking the nudge to go back for more education, which I never ever wanted to do, but I did. And God used that to grow me, to become who I am today, and the lead pastor here at Hope Community Church. I can't imagine being here, providing the leadership that I do without all of that. It's a huge gift to have been told no. It's clearly what God had in mind. But when I was in the pit, it didn't make any sense. And the same is true for you. Don't stay in the pit. Don't stay. Ask your questions, but don't quit. Don't go the other way. Pursue God. His word will guide you. People in whom his spirit lives will guide you through your disappointing situations. Would you pray with me? Worship team, come on up. Oh, God, help us. Help us. Help those that are here this morning who are just struggling to believe that you can really be good, that you can be God, because their life has just had too many big pits, too many disappointing situations. Oh God, help them. Come alongside of them. Speak to them. And if you're one of them this morning, I just nudge you to just say, I believe. Just like Abraham did. And God, for those of us who have said, I believe, but are in the pit and we can't see our way out and we don't know what's happening next and we don't understand. Give us the strength and the courage to take another step. Help us. We thank you for that promise that you are with us, that you never leave us, that you are the great reward, that you are our shield. Help us to grab hold to those truths and hold them deep inside of us. It's in your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.